Culture feels like an intuition. It's the messy, unspoken rules governing how we interact, make decisions, and view the world. But for organizational scientists, that subjective feeling isn't enough. They translate human behavior into rigid mathematical grids, which presents a massive analytical problem. How exactly do researchers objectively measure and map societal norms that cannot actually be seen? To solve this, cross-cultural management research relies on a specific three-tiered statistical pipeline. At the top of the funnel, researchers input the raw, unobservable data points of human interaction. These are known as cultural elements. Next, those elements are pushed through continuous mathematical scales called dimensions. This converts abstract behaviors into quantified scores. Finally, the scored data drops into the bottom tier, where it is sorted into distinct geographic bins. These are the cultural clusters. This exact formula drives the field's most landmark research, from Geert Hofstede's foundational theories to the massive Globe study on global leadership. While this pipeline successfully builds a necessary topography for global business strategy, applying its math directly to individual employees leads to a dangerous analytical trap known as the ecological fallacy. The first step requires isolating a culture's elements. These are the core, granular building blocks that construct a society's operational reality. To understand why elements are so difficult to capture, we look to Edgar Shane's organizational model, which visualizes culture as an iceberg. Above the waterline are the observable elements. These are the daily practices, the language spoken, and the institutional structures of a society. They are easy to see, but they only represent a fraction of the culture. Below the waterline lies the massive base, the invisible, espoused values, and the deeply ingrained basic underlying assumptions. Capturing this submerged data requires immense scale. The Globe study attempted this by surveying over 17,000 middle managers across 62 distinct societies. To get an accurate reading, the Globe researchers split their survey questions into two specific types of elements: the as-is, capturing current societal practices, and the should-be, capturing the underlying societal ideals. Because the most powerful drivers of a culture are those unobservable assumptions buried below the surface, researchers cannot simply document them through observation. They must translate the survey answers into a mathematical format to compare them. This translation relies on dimensions, theoretical yardsticks designed to quantify those unobservable elements. The historical baseline for this approach comes from the pioneering work of Geert Hofstede, who first extracted cultural dimensions from corporate survey data. Between 1968 and 1972, Hofstede analyzed questionnaires from over 100,000 IBM employees globally, searching the massive data pool to isolate cross-cultural patterns. This corporate data was formalized into academia as Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory. From the data, he isolated specific bipolar dimensions, such as individualism versus collectivism and power distance. Decades later, the Globe study expanded this baseline to capture greater nuance, moving beyond Hofstede's original framework. They extended the measuring stick to 9 distinct sliders, adding metrics like performance orientation and institutional collectivism. The mechanics are straightforward. The raw survey data elements from the 62 societies are mathematically converted into numerical scores along these 9 axes. Dimensions act as the critical bridge in the formula. They convert subjective human feelings into the hard, comparable data required for global analysis. With the dimensions scored, the pipeline moves to its final step, organizing the numbers into a global taxonomy. This chart shows how researchers use multivariate statistical cluster analysis. Here, 62 countries are plotted as individual dots floating in space, positioned entirely by their dimensional coordinates. Statistical proximity dictates group membership. Countries with similar scores naturally gather together, forming the 10 distinct globe cultural clusters. This math clearly delineates groupings like the Anglo, Latin Europe, and Confucian Asia clusters. However, the dataset faces a practical limitation. It is logistically impossible to survey the localized cultural elements of every single nation on Earth. To solve this, researchers build a multivariant discriminant model, which allows them to extend the established globe clusters to holdout countries that were never surveyed. Instead of survey data, the model uses quantitative proxies. It predicts cluster membership by analyzing demographics like ethnicity, religion, major language, and colonial heritage. Based entirely on these proxies, a holdout country is mathematically sorted into its most probable home, whether that is the Eastern Europe or Sub-Saharan Africa cluster. Clusters finalize the pipeline. They give multinational organizations a simplified, predictive map to assess the risk and compatibility of cross-border mergers. A severe problem arises when managers use this global map to make localized interpersonal decisions. This chart illustrates the critical threshold where the math breaks down, the ecological fallacy. Look at the Latin America cluster, focusing solely on the dimension of in-group collectivism. That vertical line represents the cluster's average score. That dimension score is merely a macro-level statistical average of a highly varied society, sitting at the center of a wide normal distribution. The micro-reality is vastly different. The underlying elements, the personal values of citizens, and the specific practices of local firms are diverse and scattered across the entire curve. Assuming a new employee or a potential partner firm perfectly matches the cluster average is an analytical error. Predicting an individual's behavior based on their nation's macro cluster score ignores the actual observable elements operating on the ground. Dimensional averages accurately predict the friction of a massive international trade deal. They are useless for predicting the behavior of the single executive sitting across the negotiating table. There is one final, crucial variable that continually threatens the accuracy of these statistical models: the passage of time. As global communication and trade accelerate, the foundational elements of a society, their daily practices and artifacts, inevitably shift. If those underlying elements change, the dimensional scores used to measure them must be recalculated. Without updated data, the entire cluster map becomes obsolete. The pipeline remains continuous. Unobservable elements are quantified into dimensions, which are then statistically grouped into clusters. Cultural taxonomies provide a precise topographical map for global strategy. But true cross-cultural leadership requires understanding that the map is never the territory.